the U.S. imposed tariffs affecting $283 billion of Chinese imports. Canadian steel and aluminum faced $12.8 billion in tariffs. Nearly $15 billion of Mexican industrial goods received similar treatment. This dispersed approach diluted both attention and resources. Chinese officials meticulously documented every U.S. move against Canada and Mexico, effectively receiving a preview of American tactics before Beijing faced them directly.
China's response demonstrated exceptional strategic patience. When American tariffs hit Chinese goods, Beijing's retaliation targeted just $50 billion in U.S. exports, a calculated restraint. Chinese officials had observed the Trump administration's responses to Canadian and Mexican countermeasures, gaining invaluable insight into U.S. sensitivity patterns and negotiating thresholds. While Washington expected quick capitulation, Beijing executed a long-term strategy.
On the domestic front, America's fragmented approach created significant vulnerabilities. Canada's retaliatory tariffs surgically targeted products from Republican-held congressional districts in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. Mexico focused on agricultural exports from Iowa, Nebraska, and Indiana, crucial electoral battlegrounds. By December 2018, farm bankruptcies in the Midwest rose 19% year over year. This domestic economic pressure complicated the administration's China strategy, creating a feedback loop between international posturing and internal political constraints that Beijing observed and later exploited with precisely targeted agricultural sanctions. The multi-front approach created an asymmetry in leadership continuity that further disadvantaged American negotiators. President Xi Jinping, secure in his position of indefinite leadership, maintained consistent negotiating positions across years. The U.S. approach shifted with political pressures, electoral considerations, and personnel changes. Between 2018 and 2022, the U.S. trade negotiation team experienced 7 key leadership changes. China's core economic team remained intact. This stability advantage allowed Beijing to maintain strategic coherence while America's position fluctuated like a weather vane in changing winds. USMCA, the unintentional playbook, China used in trade negotiations. Each concession America made to Canada or Mexico during the United States, Mexico-Canada Agreement USMCA negotiations, provided Chinese officials with insights into U.S. flexibility patterns. When U.S. negotiators eventually returned to the table with China, they faced counterparts who possessed a comprehensive database of American negotiating tactics from 2 separate diplomatic engagements. As one former U.S. trade official anonymously acknowledged, "We essentially gave them our playbook before we even sat down to negotiate."
While American attention was divided across multiple fronts, Beijing accelerated its long-term diversification strategy. China rapidly expanded trade relationships with Brazil, increased infrastructure investment in Africa through the Belt and Road Initiative, and deepened economic ties with the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. By 2022, China had negotiated 19 new bilateral trade agreements, creating alternative markets for goods previously destined for the U.S.
The evidence of this strategic error is clear. During peak multi-front trade negotiations in 2019, U.S.-China talks stalled for 131 days, while American negotiators finalized USMCA details. In that same period, China signed $67 billion in new agricultural purchase agreements with Brazil, Argentina, and Russia, directly replacing U.S. suppliers who had lost access to Chinese markets. This represented a strategic repositioning that Chinese officials accelerated during America's moment of diplomatic distraction. China's sophisticated retaliation arsenal. Those multi-billion-dollar agricultural agreements were merely the visible edge of a much deeper transformation. What began as a reactive scramble in 2018 has evolved into something far more calculated and formidable. China's economic resilience, currently maintaining a robust 5% annual growth rate, provides Beijing with a strategic buffer that simply didn't exist during the first round of tariffs. This economic foundation allows Chinese leadership to absorb punitive measures while deploying carefully calibrated responses, revealing a fundamental shift in how China approaches economic conflict.
The transformation of China's approach is remarkable when examining key phases of development. 2018, initial disorganized countermeasures following first American tariffs. 2019 to 2020, systematic analysis of American economic vulnerabilities. 2021, present, deployment of sophisticated, precisely calibrated responses.
Chinese officials now operate with methodical precision, drawing from an extensive economic toolkit that extends beyond simple tariff retaliation. This arsenal includes targeted import restrictions, strategic export controls, and sector-specific regulatory measures that can be deployed with surgical precision. American corporations operating in China have faced unexpected safety inspections, licensing delays, and enhanced customs scrutiny, measures that carry plausible deniability while exerting maximum pressure on business interests. The evolution reflects a sophisticated understanding of American economic vulnerabilities. Rather than matching tariffs dollar for dollar, a contest China couldn't win in 2018, Beijing has developed asymmetric responses that target specific pressure points in the American economy. Chinese officials have transformed their approach through systematic preparation, carefully documenting political and economic pressure points that emerged during early trade conflicts. Perhaps most concerning is China's potential to weaponize its dominant position in rare earth elements. These critical minerals form the backbone of advanced technology and defense industries, everything from smartphones to missile guidance systems. China controls approximately 80% of global rare earth processing capacity, providing Beijing with extraordinary leverage. Even subtle hints at potential supply restrictions can send shockwaves through American technology and defense sectors without formal export controls. What makes China's position particularly formidable is its deliberate restraint. Despite having numerous economic weapons at its disposal, Beijing has carefully calibrated its responses, implementing measured countermeasures that signal resolve without triggering uncontrollable escalation. This strategic patience maintains negotiating flexibility while preserving more severe options as deterrents against further American measures. Simultaneously, China has systematically reduced its vulnerability through economic diversification. Since 2018, Beijing has strengthened trade relationships across Europe, Asia, Africa, and Latin America, creating redundancies in supply chains that reduce dependency on American markets. While the United States focused on tariff battles, China constructed alternative economic infrastructure that diminishes American leverage.
China's sustained economic growth provides crucial insulation against trade disruptions. This economic buffer gives Chinese negotiators a strategic advantage: time. While American officials typically operate under political pressure for quick results, Chinese leaders can afford patience, allowing economic fundamentals to strengthen their position during extended negotiations.
The cumulative effect represents a fundamental shift in global economic power dynamics. What began as reactive trade defense has evolved into proactive economic statecraft, reshaping global relationships in ways that enhance China's long-term influence. The permanent restructuring of global supply chains. Beyond Beijing's sophisticated retaliation methods lies a profound and irreversible consequence of the trade war. The global trade landscape is undergoing structural transformation that cannot be undone with simple policy adjustments. The ripple effects we've discussed have culminated in a permanent reconfiguration of international commerce, with China strategically positioned at its center. The Belt and Road Initiative exemplifies China's accelerated response to U.S. trade confrontation. This massive infrastructure development program has expanded dramatically across Asia, Africa, and Latin America, creating an intricate network of trade routes that systematically circumvent American influence. Like an architect redesigning a city's transportation system, Beijing is constructing an alternative commercial architecture where it serves as the central hub, connecting previously isolated economic regions into a cohesive network. The repercussions extend beyond China's immediate sphere. America's closest neighbors have initiated strategic pivots away from U.S. market dependence. Canadian businesses have significantly expanded export relationships with Japan, Australia, and Southeast Asian nations through the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. Simultaneously, Canadian trade with Europe has flourished under the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement,
representing fundamental reorientations of economic relationships that will persist regardless of future U.S. policy shifts.
Mexico's trade diversification follows a similar pattern, establishing deeper commercial ties with partners unaffected by America's unpredictable trade stance. Both nations have recognized that over-reliance on the U.S. market constitutes a strategic vulnerability requiring permanent structural changes to their trade relationships.
Perhaps most consequential is China's methodical approach to securing agricultural independence. Beijing has made strategic investments across South America and Africa, creating robust alternative supply chains for critical food imports. This agricultural diversification includes enhanced meat imports from European nations like Spain and the Netherlands, chosen specifically for their stringent food safety regulations and competitive pricing. These investments represent the construction of permanent agricultural partnerships designed to eliminate dependency on American farmers. The psychological dimension of this restructuring cannot be overstated. Corporate leaders worldwide now view U.S. trade policy through a fundamentally different lens. The erratic nature of American tariff decisions has triggered a perception shift that transcends temporary market adjustments. Multinational executives increasingly operate under the assumption that U.S. policy unpredictability is the new normal, requiring permanent contingency planning rather than temporary adaptations. This psychological shift manifests in concrete business decisions, similar to how homeowners might install flood barriers after experiencing devastating water damage. Companies are implementing lasting changes to their operational structures, relocating production facilities, and reconfiguring supply chains not as short-term responses to immediate tariff pressures, but as fundamental risk mitigation strategies.
While American policymakers focus on tariff battles and quarterly trade statistics, China's strategic patience allows it to capitalize on these seismic shifts in global commerce. Beijing recognizes that the most consequential outcome isn't immediate GDP impact, but the permanent restructuring of supply chains, which invariably strengthens China's position as an indispensable hub in global trade networks.
This restructuring creates a self-reinforcing cycle. As businesses adapt to avoid tariff uncertainty, their adaptations further embed China's central role. The result is an evolving commercial architecture increasingly organized around Beijing rather than Washington. The irony is striking. Measures intended to pressure China have accelerated the creation of trade networks that bypass American economic influence entirely. Tariffs designed as temporary leverage have triggered permanent structural changes that systematically diminish U.S. economic centrality while enhancing China's long-term position. America's misguided tariff approach treats economic warfare as disconnected skirmishes rather than an interconnected ecosystem, failing to recognize how disruptions ripple through modern supply chains and undermine original objectives. The central lesson is clear. Economic nationalism has become an anachronism in today's integrated global markets. For America to reclaim its strategic position, a paradigm shift is essential. Policy decisions made in isolation inevitably face the counterforce of market adaptation. The profound irony is that America's attempts to contain China's economic influence have accelerated the transformation that diminishes U.S. centrality in global trade. By fracturing established patterns without alternatives, U.S. policy has created vacuums that China has filled. The world's economic architecture is being redrawn not in America's image, but increasingly in Beijing's vision.